So hi, I'm Trevor Holmes, and yes, I work in the teaching support role on campus. I also teach in women's studies, and I want to thank everybody here for showing up. I'm getting a bit of feedback, I think, on the, no? Okay. This is a teach-a-thon, so it's very tiring for some of you who have been here right from the very beginning. Feel free to stretch for a sec, those of you who haven't yet stretched if you need to. The other thing that a teach-a-thon is doing is it's not a teach-in, so it's like clearly one-directional. One way to make it less one-directional is, have you heard of oops and ouch? Anyone heard of that in activist circles or social justice circles? So one of the things that happens is, if I say something crappy and I suddenly realize, oh, that was a crappy thing to say, I might say oops, and then we'll move on. If you hear me say something crappy that's really bugging you a lot, if you feel like it, you could just say ouch, and then it's not up to you to then teach me what I did wrong. I'm going to take that ouch, and I'm going to go try and learn about it a bit more, and I'll make a note of where I did something that bugged you, okay? So I'll say oops and thanks, and we'll move on. So as a scholar, I've been exploring interactions between fiction, especially Gothic and vampire fiction, and culture, especially subcultures, sexual subcultures or minorities, for a while. I have plenty of white settler cis privilege that isn't entirely hetero, but it's definitely privilege. And so what matters about that is that I agree with blogger Phil Sandifer that learning to be a man in a transphobic and homophobic and sexist culture, sexist white culture, is to learn the ropes of a certain kind of violence, so that unlearning is a kind of disarmament. That is, guys also grow up in rape culture, right? It's the water we swim in, the air we breathe. You can't not grow up in your culture. So rape culture isn't a thing that as a guy you choose to engage in or choose not to learn. You either sleepwalk within it or you disarm. So whatever we call it, the active choice is to unlearn and to resist. And that's true for all of us, I think. And so that's one of the reasons I immediately said yes to this teach-a-thon, even though I'm very unsure of myself right now and very uncertain how to talk authoritatively as is demanded by the form of this event. So I offer a few thoughts first about culture and how it works, back and forth with literary and other texts. So I mean film and television vampires as well as literary vampires. Then I want to offer some thoughts about how insidiously rape culture works in some of our favorite narratives. And finally move to some, I think, hopeful thoughts. So here's my basic thesis. When we do things like concern troll, I hope that you know what that means. Concern troll popular fiction, television, or film, and they're apparently naive readers or viewers. Here I'm actually flagging legions of Twilight fans or Buffy fans. I number myself among the fandom of many different vampire genres. We may, in fact, when we sort of malign these people or get concerned about these people, we may, in fact, be aligning ourselves with some structural systemic scapegoating along the lines of the monster in the bushes narrative that diverts attention away from the more pervasive rape culture of everyday life. And I'm going to circle back around to this at the end of my talk. So a few comments about culture. Any text, popular or otherwise, is going to have its author's cultural surround encoded in it. And that means assumptions about gender, race, class, like, the proper way to hold a fork, if there even is a utensil in one's culture. So that'll be part of the fabric of the text and the author's backdrop, whether the author means it to be there or not. Okay. So some writers and filmmakers intentionally play around with such things and challenge us. Others really do plan to reinforce stuff like norms and values. And I'm thinking back to Katie Fulfer's talk earlier today about the ways in which authors have a responsibility to tell the truth about rape and rape culture. At the other end of the author, though, is the audience. So audiences are actually quite diverse. And over time and space, we'll sometimes be decoding those encoded cultural norms, whether we know we're doing this or not, sometimes not, because it's often the water we swim in. We're going to be doing this decoding in various ways. And so I want to think a little bit about the responsibility of the readers towards the text and the writers. So it's easier in some ways to decode the encoded stuff like a century later or a half century later, or when encountering creative works from some position other than the dominant one, right? So the Gothic is a popular genre. Often it'll have embattled young heroine who is being in some way or another beset. So she'll be kept prisoner by a rotten, creepy relative, or tricked and attacked by a monstrous supernatural entity, or pursued romantically by exactly the wrong kind of attractive stranger who has come to town. So you can perhaps see already how our contemporary narratives share common ground with a couple of hundred years' worth of very popular novels, many of which are lost to us, unfortunately. So how does this work with the history of vampire fiction? So a thumbnail sketch of how vampires came into this gothic mode. Several cultures have these energy-draining, soul-sucking, or blood-sucking monsters in the narratives by which they understand themselves, right? A certain thing kind of happened with the advent of Romanticism in the early 1800s, late 1700s. Vampires got unsurprisingly romanticized. So Lord Byron becomes fictionalized for the second time, actually, as Lord Riven. And in this second time, it's as a vampire in a story by John Polidori. Some decades later, we see Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which has a father attempting to protect his daughter from a dangerous draining by an Eastern European woman. So that's about halfway between Polidori's work and the late Victorian Bram Stoker, who, of course, is the author of Dracula. And what I've done there is kind of skip across some of the male canon, such as it is, of some vampire fiction writers. So centering in on Dracula for a second, much has been written about Dracula and about vampire fiction and film and television since. So why do we love these evil, undead creatures so much? What do they represent? Right? Clearly, and I don't think this is all that controversial, vampire blood-sucking and vampire transformations are metaphors for many things, including sex and sexual violence. They aren't just monsters being violent. They are monsters being sexually violent, or possibly sometimes being super hot and seductive. And this is part of the problem. Right? In their constant potential threat of non-consensual power and control, they do represent rape culture really well. Perhaps too conveniently, they almost always come from elsewhere, right? And this is where my mind starts ticking away about our stranger in the bushes narrative, right? So what are our cultural monsters? It's often this individualized, protect yourself from the stranger in the bushes narrative. But rape culture is actually formed of many sets of hegemonic meanings. And those meanings often get centered on what we do as individuals to protect ourselves or not. So the message to women, obviously, to be vigilant and ever watchful and protect themselves at night, in downtowns, in deserted areas, especially in downtown deserted areas at night, in nightclubs that are full of people. Because why? Because of stranger danger, right? Vampires, I think, represent stranger danger. Besides all the other things they represent, they often come from abroad or away. They're the monstrous other. They're not like our kind uncles or boyfriends or fathers or friends of friends who are actually the actual people we often need to fear. So it's easier to put the threat of assault and the threat of sexual assault on them. So which doesn't really explain why we love vampires so much. Why do we love vampires so much? Seems kind of masochistic almost. Not that there's anything wrong with masochism. But surely that is part of rape culture too. Telling women what women really want. To be, in this case, it seems in many of the narratives, mastered by a bad boy. That narrative of dark desires for abandon, and I'm using scare quotes here, that is in our culture accompanied by the narrative for boys and men growing up of uncontrollable lust. That shaky Coke bottle that Rashmi was talking about. So that once a tap is opened, you can't actually shut that tap. And this is exactly what bugs people so much about Twilight, right? Yes, we need to talk about Twilight again. The aptly named abstinence porn, in which male desire is uncontrollable lust, and it's up to women to temper their own desires in order to not to ignite the men's. So there's something else, though. As I suggested earlier, we're already in conversation growing up in any culture. It's like there's already a dinner party going on that you haven't yet joined. And so as soon as you read a text or engage in a conversation about a literary text, you're joining a conversation that's already happening. So the writers, the texts, and the readers are all joining an existing conversation. So vampire human desire is, I've said elsewhere, an always already transposed kind of form from what we might call sex itself, as though that is an easy thing to know. But it's transposed into a different key, if you follow my musical metaphor. So the body parts are different, the fluids are different, the possibilities are all just that much different with vampires. So that one can see that existing conversation slightly askew, or from the outside of the conversation. The normative, typical conversation about so-called simple-to-understand sex itself. Right? So that it kind of distances us from those norms. It's transposed onto this different key. So a very productive element of being a vampire fiction fan is the opportunity, and not everyone seizes it, but the opportunity or the invitation to sing that conversation in a different key. So that is what to me is powerful about the figures of the vampire in literary history and in contemporary representations. It's not always so hopeful, and so I'd like to return for a moment to Dracula and the difference between the stranger in the bushes and the systemic or structural narratives that I see in that text. So, of course, we see in Dracula a portrayal of rape culture that's actually more pervasive, more representative of the everyday accretions of those messages by which women come to guard themselves rather than enjoy themselves, by which men and women end up slut-shaming and blaming other women, by which girls come to understand every day how they need to police their own bodies, clothes, behaviors, and that of their peers. Right? This portrayal of Dracula, of which I speak, the actual vampire, I know he's not real, but in the text, right, is not the monster himself, the stranger in the bushes. The problem that I see with thinking that only Dracula is the danger here is that we leave it at that, we're doing the stranger in the bushes thing. There's this other moment in the text that I think speaks to the structural elements here that I'm getting at. It's about Lucy and having to kill Lucy. So if you know anything about the narrative, Lucy kind of is a bit too flirty, and she ends up a vampire, and she ends up needing to be killed by 4 men who gather around, and the person who has to drive the stake very violently through her heart and put an apple or stuff her mouth with something and do all this awful stuff is her fiancé. All right. So the fact that this is narratively okay, and they're the heroes of the narrative for doing so, to me, speaks towards the structural and systemic elements of rape culture. So if you notice in the novel how dramatically this scene occurs and the ways in which it metaphorizes violent sex, this is a kind of metaphorical but narratively okay rape. If you compare and contrast Lucy and Mina, the good girl, the bad girl kind of discourse happens, and I'm just skipping ahead here because of time. And you end up with this legitimized form of hero rape. Thank you. So skip ahead a century or so, and you get some more self-conscious work on vampire representations that maybe do a more intentional job of talking about consent and staging rape culture in order to overturn it. So if you're interested, you could look at Jewel Gomez's Gilda Stories, which is more of a lesbian feminist utopic approach. And I think also Buffy the Vampire Slayer, in which tropes are generally turned on their head. So in preparation for today, I wanted to see what the blogosphere might be saying about that moment in Buffy the Vampire Slayer in which Spike nearly rapes Buffy. This is what a lot of the fandom was talking about some years ago, right? Including the aftermath behavior around it. There goes my alarm. So I guess the blogger was suggesting that she wishes that episode had never happened. And I guess what I'm saying is, if a popular culture text portrays sexual assault, it may not only be in order to teach women to be passive and men how to rape. It may also be showing us the operations of rape culture rather than endorsing rape culture. So representation can give us the tools to dismantle and unencode those encoded narratives and hold them up to critique. So I'll close with some lines from Sarah Seltzer, who was a blogger in 2008 on Alternet, who historicized Twilight in relation to Dracula, tying it to young women's need to explore their sexuality. So instead of concern trolling the legions of young female fans, she suggests, just as Dracula's reactionary plotlines failed to bring back Victorian mores, Twilight's unfortunate gender roles will join abstinence only on the trash heap of history. Some of its screaming young fans will grow up to be sexually empowered, some won't, and some won't end up fancying men dead or undead at all. But they'll all share the fact that Twilight's dangerous liaison turned them on. And that's what vampires, even sparkly ones, are for. Thanks.